Hi, my name is Mary Diggs-Hobson, and I'm the Executive Director of African Americans Reach and Teach Health Ministry, located here in Seattle. And we're here today to talk about some of the work that we're doing with the Healthy Homes Environmental Health Project in Seattle, working with actually in SeaTac and Tukwila with the Ethiopian and African American communities. And part of this project is to really help educate our community about how to decrease and minimize the toxic chemicals and products in our homes and in our environment to make sure that we are living healthier. The project is funded by the Seattle Public Utilities and the local hazardous waste management program for this community. And we're here to talk today with Laura Matter, who is our special guest, and she is the program manager for the Garden Hotlines, which is part of Seattle Tilt. And she's going to tell us all we need to know about having a natural, healthy garden.
Great. Thank you, Mary. Yeah, so my name is Laura, and I work with Seattle Tilt. Our program is also sponsored. Garden Hotline is sponsored by the local hazardous waste management program in Seattle Public Utilities. And our mission is to talk to people about how to keep your garden healthy and how to keep yourself healthy in your gardening life. So we're at Bradner Gardens here. Seattle Tilt actually has a garden on site here off to our left. And we do a lot of classes out of this site. So I'm going to take you on a little tour to show you about how to build healthy soil, how to choose the right plants for the right site in your garden, how to water properly, both by saving water and by also protecting water quality. And then also we're going to talk a little bit about pest management. We won't see a lot today because it's getting late in the season, but we'll talk about ways to bring good bugs into your garden in order to combat the bad bugs.
Okay, Laura. So let's talk about what does it take to have healthy soil. What do you do?
Okay. So healthy soil is made up of organic matter, which comes from leaves and things that you chop up out of your garden. It's also made up of mineral content, which is rock and stone that's broken down. And then you have air and water in the soil as well. And a lot of life. So there's a lot of organisms in the soil. There can be up to 4,000 different kinds of organisms in soil, including things that you see like worms, but also very small things that help to make soil alive and healthy and available for plants. So this is what you want your soil to look like, nice and loose. This has a mixture of the mineral content and the organic content. See how nice and loose that is? Good for growing things. If you're buying soil, you want to look for soil that also is nice and loose like that.
So what about composting? Where does that come in?
Composting is the process of breaking down all the organic matter, the leaves, the plant trimmings. When you're through with your vegetable garden, the things you pull out, you can cut up and throw into a pile. And we can go look at a compost pile in a minute. But basically, it's matter that goes back into the soil, and compost can be purchased. Of course, when we do our curb waste pickup from the city of Seattle, we send it all off and it gets composted commercially. And then Cedar Grove is one of the companies who turns around and sells it back to us as compost, which is a beautiful, very dark substance. Wow. And you're going to just add that back into soil. So you just dig that back in, and that helps enrich your soil and keeps it nice and loose like that.
So one question I've been dying to ask is about fertilizer. You know, everybody knows that you need to fertilize your soil, but what are the healthy ways to do that?
So that's a really good question, because chemical fertilizers are very common, but they're very mobile in the soil and they're not good for our local water. So a lot of times people will throw those out. The plant doesn't necessarily take it all up, and a lot of it runs off into local streams and out into Puget Sound. things like that can cause algae blooms, make less oxygen for fish in the water. So we really recommend that people use natural fertilizers. And by that we mean things that are made out of organic components. Again, much like the compost. Compost is one way to enrich your soil. You can also use and buy the natural fertilizers from the store. So you can find organic fertilizers that say organic. They're going to have things in the ingredient column that are things like cottonseed meal or alfalfa meal. They're going to be obvious, have been made from nature. But you can also do other things like grow a cover crop. So across the bed here, we have cover crop growing. It's going to serve the function of fertilizing the soil. It's going to add nitrogen to the soil, so next spring when it gets dug in, it's actually enriching the soil. But it also will protect the soil all winter from the rain. So it'll keep something actively growing. It'll keep the rain from leaching nutrient out of the soil, and it'll keep it from compacting the soil all winter long. Plus, it's pretty to look at. One of the things that you can plant is crimson clover. And this is a very fine seed that's, that actually has a beautiful red flower on it in the spring. Mm-hmm. And you can put it out there if you like. There we go.
Okay.
So
Broadcasting.
cover crop seeds. I brought both rye and crimson clover today just to show you what that looks like. Mm-hmm. Rye seed is actually a cereal grain. So much, like we have oats and wheat and rye. All of these things are cereal grains that grow up as a grass like what we see across the field here.
So I can toss this
out?
out?
You can toss that out there.
Oh, okay.
And the other thing you can do to protect your soil, in this case, we have a straw mulch here, and you also see a bunch of wood chips here behind us. And both of those things not only add nutrient to the soil when they start to decompose, but they do the same thing that the cover crop does to protect soil from compaction and loss of nutrient in the wintertime. So all of these things are actually ways to fertilize that we don't think about and ways to enrich your soil.
Well, this is very educational for me because I see, even in my yard, I will see what I think to be weeds.
Right.
And it's actually the nature's way of taking care of the soil.
That's right. So we're looking at calendula, which can be used as a cover crop. It's also a great flower to attract insects to the garden that are beneficial for your garden. And behind the calendula is winter field pea, and that is a pea family plant that puts lots of nitrogen back in the soil, not only from the leaf when you dig it in, but at the root level, where it actually traps nitrogen out of the air. And then we see some ryegrass right behind it, and that is a cereal grain that will also be good fodder for digging back into the soil. And then to the far right, we've got fava bean, which is also a pea family plant, but that will also have food on it so that you can harvest and eat next spring. So we've got rye grass in Mary's hand here, and that's the bigger seed. That's the cereal grain. And then the one I have in my gloved hand here is the crimson clover. And these are a great combination. You can put these out together. You don't have to have them separated. You can mix them in, and they will be really beautiful green grass. And then the crimson clover gets a beautiful red flower on it in the spring.
Okay, so we were talking about composting, and we were talking about the healthy soil, and I know it's really important. But can you tell us a lot more about composting and the different kinds of composting?
Sure. So there are different ways to compost. You can compost yard waste and other materials in a bin like the ones behind us here. Or you can do food composting at home in like a small container that you have worms in and do worm composting. But whatever way you go, you're collecting materials to put into it. And I can show you a few materials that we have at the garden here. Mm-hmm. So this is just basically the things that people would collect to put in. Now some of this, actually, these are good plants, these strawberry plants, so somebody could take those home and plant them. But if you don't want to use them as a plant, you would take these out and you put them on the chopping board and you chop them all into little pieces. Mm-hmm. The smaller it is, the faster it's going to compost. Okay. So that's what we would just call yard waste. But The other thing that's really kind of spectacular that we can get in a lot of in Seattle and through our own personal use is coffee grounds. So we've got a whole bucket full of coffee grounds here. And these are literally just grounds that have come from coffee that's been made, and people bring it and put it in here. Looks like soil already. And it actually has a lot of nitrogen in it, so it's a really wonderful thing to put nutrition in your soil. You can take coffee grounds and just spread them around plants in the summertime when you want them to grow. But you can also use this as part of your composting material.
Okay, this is great to know, because now when my husband makes his coffee, we can take those grounds and use them.
Throw them out, save them. A lot of people put them in worm bins to be composted, but you can also use them directly on the ground in the garden. Do you want to see what some finished compost looks like?
Sure.
This is before you screen it, so it's a little bit rough, but take this material and you'd run it through a screen and you get kind of the tougher stuff out of it. You can see it looks like soil already. It's getting to that point. And then what's left after you screen it, the fines you put into your garden and mix in.
So this is a question I've been dying to ask you, because in my yard, I always struggle with what to plant where and when.
Yes. Good. Those are good questions. We're really fortunate in the Northwest that we can plant most of the year, but there are better times to plant, so we'll start with that. Fall, right now, is a perfect time to be planting things, especially perennial plants like this rosemary that's going to grow and be evergreen and be in our garden all year long. This is a time when the soil's still warm enough for roots to grow, but it's not going to try to put a lot of top growth out, so it's going to really get big next spring because it will have a good root system on it. Plus, if it starts to rain, we're hoping it's going to rain, then that we can take advantage of the fall rain as well. But as far as choosing what to put where, you want to look at your site. This is a pretty wide open site, but we're in an urban setting, and so sometimes things will shade you, other people's trees, your own trees, buildings next door. So you want to pay attention to how the sun moves in your yard and where it is at different times of day and in different seasons, and then you can learn what plants like. This plant, for instance, likes full sun, so I would never plant this deep in the shade of a building or a tree. Otherwise it wouldn't do very well. So when you put the right plant in the right place, you're actually helping yourself from having to do any treatment later, because when you weaken a plant by not giving it what it needs, then it's going to be more susceptible to pests and diseases. So check your site, see where the sun is, know what kind of soil you have, improve it with the ideas that we've already talked about so that you can have good healthy soil. And then make sure that a plant isn't going to be put in somewhere where it's going to get too big for its site so that you have to prune it all the time. So that's a big problem. People put things in really close to a sidewalk and it overgrows it. This is a very cute little plant. It's a rosemary. This is what we call a 4-inch pot. You buy this at the nursery just like this. This plant can get at least 3 feet tall. But in Seattle, I've often seen these guys be at least 6 feet tall. So you have to take that into consideration. Right now it looks little and cute. It's going to take up a huge amount of space. So you would want to make sure it's not planted where you have to whack on it all the time. Although rosemary you do harvest, so you can, you can put this where you need to prune it, but it's better for plants not to prune them all the time. So be aware that when you get a tree, it's usually in a little 1-gallon pot, and it looks tiny and small, but they're going to get 20 feet tall. So you have to look at that too.
Okay, so how do we determine which plants to plant that would detract or not attract, rather, pests, bugs,
Yeah, so a lot of our native plants are actually really good at that. Rosemary is not a native. Plants like this would be as well, so some of the Mediterranean herbs are pretty hardy and drought tolerant and don't attract a lot of pests. They actually attract good bugs and things that will come in and help with that. But native plants, like some of the plants you see here, this is snowberry with the little white berries on it, and then here we have a red-stemmed dogwood with the red leaves and the red stems. Those are both really great natives. They have very few pest problems in the Northwest. They're tolerant of dry soils and wet soils, which is what happens here. In the summer it's dry, in the winter it's wet. There are a lot of different kinds of native plants, and those guys are adapted to these soils and to this weather, and so you're going to have fewer issues with them, and they'll be more pest resistant and disease resistant. So choosing native plants is always a good choice. A lot of them actually are edible, so you can get things like huckleberry to put into your garden, which is a beautiful evergreen, and it also has berries on it, which is a good choice.
So Laura, what about this area over here with all of the plants and the shrubbery and so forth?
Right, so that's a native border. When Bradner was built, they put in the pea patch area and the demonstration garden, learning garden here for Seattle Tilth. There's a perennial border with pretty flowers, but they also put some time into putting native plants in. So that's an example of what a native garden would look like if you just let it be a wild native garden. There's lots of bird activity in there. There's lots of food for birds. And bringing birds into the garden is a good thing too, because it actually will help you with pest control. Birds will help to eat insects in the garden as well.
So one of the things that I find myself constantly doing is overwatering. So can you tell me a little bit more about, how to water the garden?
Yeah, so overwatering is a very, very common mistake people make. Plants need water, certainly, but they don't need to be watered every day. When you think about nature, rain comes and goes. One of the tricks to making sure things get adequate water is to have compost in your soil, because that can help hold water in the soil. But there are ways to water to minimize how much you use and to make sure you're only putting out enough. So one of the ways is to use a drip irrigation system like what we see here. And these are lines that have emitters or else just holes in the cord that actually lets water out through the beds very slowly so that water will saturate into the ground. So that's one way to set up a big area, is to do a drip irrigation system. You can use a soaker hose. If you're watering by hand, you would come and water at the base of each of your plants. You don't need to water the whole bed.
Okay.
Right?
Okay.
So if you water the whole bed, that's great if these plants are big enough to be using all of that ground space for their roots. But when they're not, you're actually just watering soil that doesn't need it and will encourage weeds to grow instead. So you water at the base of the plant, and then after you've put water in, dig down in the area where you're actually watering and look at the soil and see how wet it is.
Okay.
So for instance, when soil is moist enough, it will clump together a bit like that. So you can see how dark brown that is. If it was dry, it would be more crumbly and loose, and it wouldn't be this dark in color.
Okay.
So you can look at the color, and you can look at the feel of it, and feel and see that it's sticking together.
Okay.
And that lets you know that it's still got enough moisture in it. So you wouldn't need to water this bed right now. It would be fine. So we've got drought-tolerant plants in the landscape too. So things like this plant don't take up a lot of water, cistus and different kinds of grasses. These guys can grow quite large. You always need to water things when you first plant them, but you do not need to water them every day or even every week in the summer once they're established if they are a drought-tolerant plant. This summer, of course, was a little bit different because it was so dry out. So we would definitely have needed to be paying attention to some of this. But for the most part, plants that you see like this are very drought tolerant and good choices for the garden.
So what's happening with these plants here, Laura? What's going on?
Well, partly they're green beans, so it's getting late in the season for them. It's actually been quite warm this fall. Normally green beans would be long gone, but so some of what you're seeing is just natural dieback, but also these have a new pest on them called a southern green stink bug. And it's new to the Seattle area as of last year. We started seeing them probably midsummer last year. This particular pest, it was established in California. They hadn't seen it in Washington State until last year. So this bug loves green beans, so it will eat the heck out of them. And you can actually see some right here. So there's one here. And this is what we call a true bug. And so it goes through different stages of growth from big to little. So instead of having like a caterpillar that turns into a flying insect, it actually just has a little egg that hatches, and then it's a little bug, a bigger bug, a bigger bug, and it goes through about 5 stages. So there's another one here that's a little bit smaller, you can see. And they also go through some color changes as they mature. So sometimes you'll see them be really bright, spotted red and black, and you'll see all the different stages of them. But they're bad news for Washington. We're keeping an eye on where they're spreading. And at the Garden Hotline, we actually made a map to show where we're seeing them in the city right now.
So how do you get rid of them?
Well, you would pull this out, and actually you can stomp on them if you want to. You can put them in soapy water, or just throw them in your yard waste bin, and they'll get composted eventually.
So we just finished talking about the invasion of the bad bugs.
Right.
Okay. So what about the good bugs? I've been hearing about good bugs.
So there are lots of good bugs. Good bugs are actually what is called a predator of a bad bug. So there are things that will eat them or lay eggs in them and somehow kill them for us. So there are ways to bring those into your garden, actually, and encourage that. The plants I'm holding right now, these are all herbs. The rosemary we looked at earlier, some thyme and some sage. And when you let these flower, the flowers attract not only pollinators like bees, which are really important if you want tomato and eggplant and other fruiting plants, but they will bring in little insects like lady beetles, which most people are familiar with, the little black and red beetles. They'll bring in a little parasitic wasp that lays eggs in aphids and kills them. And those are the kinds of things that you want to bring in to try and combat that the southern green stink bug that we saw, because that will help you decrease the population of them, other than the things that you actually do to pull it out. So plants like this are really important. So flowers in the garden are more than just decoration. They're really functional to actually make sure that your garden is alive and healthy. If you have lots of those interspersed in a vegetable garden in particular, you're going to have a lot of help with pests.
So it allows nature to take care of its own.
That's right.
Without all of the chemicals and the toxins that we put in our soil to kind of get rid of the bad bugs.
That's right.
And
so, like for instance, there was a garden I was taking care of that had a artichoke plant in it, and it had black aphid on it. And I was watching it. The population was building up a little bit, but then over time, I saw that they started dying off. And I looked closer and realized that those little parasitic wasps were at work. And they were there because we had certain flowers in the garden. So a lot of the things you see behind. So a plant like fennel has this little umbrella-shaped flower, and this attracts those parasitic wasps. So anything with this flower shape, really useful for that. Lots of herbs in this family, like cilantro and dill and parsley. So you plant those, you let a little bit of it bloom, harvest what you want to use, and then that will bring in those little wasps. And then this is a big sage. So this is a sage that's grown up, and it'll have big flowers on it that will attract lots of insects and bees. This is rosemary. So remember that little pot?
Yeah.
This is how big your rosemary gets. So that's why I was saying you need to know how big something's going to get when you purchase it. It's quite a bit of difference, isn't there?
Yeah. Right, you know where to plant it. Yeah.
And this is blooming now, which is great for late season. So it's good for the bees in the late season, but also really good to bring in predatory insects as well. So here's just 3 plants right here that are really great. But there's another one that's even better. Borage, which is this little blue flower. It grows kind of like a wildflower, weedy everywhere. This is wonderful for honeybees. So late in the season, they need food to gather up energy for the winter. So this is a really good plant for them. But this plant here, with the big wide leaves and the orange flowers, that's nasturtium. So it's edible. You can eat this flower, and you can actually eat all these flowers. This has sort of a peppery taste. It's really tasty. But this is really good, what we call a trap crop. We use this to trick aphids that like things like green beans. It will come to this plant instead, and then it will cover it, and you pull it out and throw it in the yard waste bin, so that you're tricking the bugs to go to this plant rather than the plant you're trying to grow food off of.
Natural strategies.
And it's pretty in the meantime, and you can eat it. So great choice. Another good choice is calendula, which we looked at earlier. So this attracts lots of insects to the garden. The things that you're looking at, we have examples of here, 3 major plant families. So the daisy family, which calendula is part of, or dahlia, which is in front of us, the pink.
Beautiful pink, yeah.
Isn't that gorgeous? Or sunflower. Those are all in the daisy family. And then we have the things like the rosemary and the sage and thyme, all those plants that I just had in my hand. Those are all perfect. Those are Mediterranean herbs, and that's in the mint family. And then you've got things like the fennel, the parsley, cilantro, and that's in the carrot family.
Yeah, you know what I'm noticing is where they're positioned and placed in the garden, and that they're acting like a barrier.
They are.
You know, like a fortress.
Exactly.
And so that's, that's natural strategy.
It is, and that's why people do that. You'll see plots rimmed with marigolds, for instance, on purpose.
Just protecting everything else that's on the inside.
And not only that, it actually brings bees in. So if you have tomatoes growing, for instance, you're not going to get very many tomatoes unless you have bumblebees around, because bumblebees are the primary. So you'll see a lot of flowers scattered around like that for that reason too.
Okay.
But yeah, it makes a beautiful garden as well as it's really functional.
Great.
Yep.
Okay. Great.
So we've got a lot of plants here that can overwinter. We've got chard over to the left, the really crinkly leaf, and a little bit of kale at the base. Those are more winter hardy greens. And then as you kind of come across the garden, you see some lettuce. That will go away if we get a really heavy frost, but it's great in the cool weather. And then there's carrot over here with the lacy leaf. That's related to those other plants we were talking about, like parsley and dill. If you were to let that bloom, you'd get that same kind of flower on it. But people overwinter those, and they often will put like mulch or straw at the base of it to protect the root from freezing. And then you can just come out in the winter and pull a few fresh carrots. This is a public garden. The pea patch system, where these plots are, you have to apply for, and there are fees that go with them, but there's also some help with that. So if people are low income, they can actually get help and not have to pay for their plot. They're different sizes depending on the size of the garden that they're in, generally about 100 square feet. Some of them are 200. Not too many of them. There's the garden I garden in, they can go up to as big as 800 square feet. We're a 2-acre site where I garden. But these are smaller, and basically you just garden them through the year. Some people choose to do what we saw behind us here, just mulch it over for the winter. So they've got their gardens winterized now. They've got the burlap and the leaves underneath. This is another technique to protect soil in the wintertime. And then they've got the winter greens that will stay through the winter. So it's very simple. They won't have much work to do this winter, but they're actually working their plot by doing this. So this is improving soil as it sits through the winter.